What if a single question could shatter the walls you've built around your heart? What if a stranger's innocent words could drag you back to a battlefield you've spent years trying to forget? What if the past you buried under layers of silence suddenly came knocking, wearing the curious face of a child? Under the wide Montana sky, where the Rockies loom like silent sentinels, a story began to unfold, one that would strip a man down to the raw edges of his soul. It started on a day that smelled of pine and crisp autumn air, a day that promised nothing more than the quiet hum of routine. But beneath the surface of that quiet, something stirred, something unspoken, waiting to claw its way into the light. Sergeant Daniel Harper stood at the edge of a clearing near Flathead Lake, his boots sinking into the damp earth, the weight of his old army jacket hanging heavy on his shoulders. At 42, his face carried the map of a life hard-lived, deep lines etched around hazel eyes that seemed to look right through you, a jaw set tight as if holding back 1,000 unsaid things. His hands, calloused from years of gripping rifles and shovels in the deserts of Iraq, now fidgeted with a small pocket knife, carving pointless shapes into a piece of driftwood he'd picked up by the shore. The lake stretched out before him, a glassy mirror reflecting the jagged peaks, but Daniel saw none of it. His mind was elsewhere, always elsewhere, trapped in the echo of gunfire, in the memory of sand and blood and names he couldn't bring himself to say out loud. He lived alone in a small cabin just a mile from this spot, a place he'd bought with his veterans' benefits after coming back to the States. Montana was supposed to be his refuge, a land of wide-open spaces where a man could lose himself in the vastness and pretend the past didn't exist. He'd chosen this corner of the world for its silence, for the way the wind howled through the valleys like it could drown out the screams in his head. But even here in the shadow of the mountains, peace was a fleeting thing. The stars at night were too bright, too much like the flares over Fallujah. The crack of a branch in the forest too often sounded like a sniper's shot, and the solitude, God help him, the solitude, was a double-edged sword, both a balm and a curse. Daniel's days followed a predictable rhythm, a deliberate march through mundane tasks to keep the darkness at bay. Mornings started with black coffee on the porch, the kind so strong it could strip paint, brewed in an old percolator his grandpa had used back in the day. He'd watch the mist rise off the lake, his breath fogging in the cold, and try not to let his thoughts wander too far. Then came the chores, chopping wood with a rhythm that felt like a battle drill, fixing fences that didn't really need fixing, anything to keep his hands busy. Afternoons were spent at the local diner in Polson, a no-frills joint called Mabel's Place, where the waitresses knew his order before he sat down. Burger, no onions, extra fries, and a Coke. He'd sit at the counter nodding to the regulars, old-timers in flannel and trucker caps who talked about the weather and the upcoming Grizzlies football game. But he never said much. They didn't ask either. Small-town folk in Montana knew the look of a man carrying ghosts. They gave him space, let him sip his drink in peace. But beneath the surface of this carefully constructed normalcy, there was a fracture, a hairline crack in the dam he'd built around his memories. It showed in the way his hands sometimes shook when he poured his coffee, in the way he'd startle at the sound of a car backfiring on the highway. It was there in the dog tags he still kept in a drawer, hidden under a pile of socks, as if out of sight meant out of mind. And it was there in the dreams, night after night, the same faces, the same voices calling for help, voices he hadn't been able to save. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, the taste of desert dust in his mouth, and stumble to the bathroom to splash cold water on his face, staring at a stranger in the mirror. He was a man living on borrowed time, waiting for something to break, though he couldn't say what. Most days Daniel avoided people beyond the bare minimum. He wasn't unkind, just guarded. A man who'd learned the hard way that letting someone in meant letting the pain in, too. But every now and then, he'd volunteer for small community tasks, as if testing himself, as if proving he could still be part of the world. This weekend, it was helping out with a local Boy Scout troop near the lake. The scoutmaster, a cheerful bear of a man named Hank Reynolds, had called him up a week ago, all hearty Montana hospitality, asking if Daniel could swing by and talk about wilderness survival. "You've got the skills, man," Hank had said over the phone, his voice booming. These kids could learn a thing or two from a real soldier. Daniel had hesitated, the word soldier hitting like a punch, but he'd agreed. Maybe it was the guilt of saying no, or maybe it was the faint hope that doing something good might quiet the noise in his head, if only for an hour. So here he was on a Saturday morning in late October, standing at the edge of the clearing as the scouts set up camp. The air was sharp with the scent of fallen leaves and campfire smoke, the kind of day that made you think of apple pie and Friday night football games under the lights. The boys, ranging from 10 to 14, were a blur of energy in their khaki uniforms and bright orange vests, laughing as they struggled with tent poles and tripped over guy lines. Daniel watched them from a distance, his arms crossed, feeling like an outsider in a world of innocence he no longer understood. Their voices carried over the rustle of the wind, high-pitched and carefree, talking about video games and the latest Marvel flick. Hank was in the middle of it all, clapping kids on the back, tossing out phrases like "attaboy" and "let's hustle," his grin wide enough to light up the whole darn forest. Daniel adjusted the brim of his faded baseball cap, an old army one with the insignia half worn off, and took a deep breath. He'd prepared a few things to say, basic stuff about building a fire, reading a compass, staying calm if you got lost. Simple lessons, practical ones, the kind he'd learned the hard way in places far rougher than these pine woods. He told himself this would be easy. Just talk, share a few tips, maybe even crack a smile if he could muster it. Then he could go back to his cabin, back to the quiet, back to the life he'd carved out of nothing. But as he stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel path, a strange unease settled in his chest, a whisper of something he couldn't name. It was as if the air itself held its breath, waiting for a storm he couldn't yet see. The scouts noticed him approaching, and a hush fell over the group, the kind of respectful, quiet kids reserve for someone they've been told is important. Hank turned, waving him over with a big, calloused hand. "Hey fellas, gather round. This here's Sergeant Harper, and he's going to teach us how to survive out in the wild. Give him a big Montana welcome." A chorus of "hey" and "hi, sir" rippled through the group, and Daniel nodded, clearing his throat, feeling the weight of their curious gazes. Up close, the boys were a patchwork of freckles and braces, scrawny limbs and wide eyes, some chewing on granola bars, others clutching water bottles like lifelines. He scanned their faces, trying to focus, trying to anchor himself in the moment, when one of them, a small kid, maybe 11, with messy brown hair and a smudge of dirt on his cheek, stepped forward, his expression a mix of awe and something else, something piercing. The boy tilted his head, studying Daniel with an intensity that made the sergeant's skin prickle. Then, in a voice so soft it almost got lost in the wind, the kid spoke. "Sir, are you my dad? My mom says he was a soldier and he never came back. I've been looking for him. Is it you?" The words hit Daniel like a grenade, exploding through the fragile armor he'd spent years building. His breath caught, sharp and ragged, as the world seemed to tilt under his feet. The other scouts froze, sensing the shift, their chatter dying into an uneasy silence. Hank's smile faltered, his hand half raised as if to intervene, but unsure how. Daniel stared at the boy, at those desperate, searching eyes, and felt something inside him crack wide open. A wound he thought he'd buried in the sands of a foreign country, now bleeding fresh and raw under the Montana sky. Who was this kid? And why, in God's name, did his question feel like a key turning in a lock Daniel had sworn never to open again? Daniel stood frozen, the boy's words echoing in his skull like distant artillery fire. His chest tightened, each breath a labored pull against an invisible weight. Those eyes, those damn searching eyes, cut through him sharper than any blade he'd ever faced in combat. The kid's voice, small and trembling with hope, was a ghost from a life he'd tried to bury, a life he'd sworn never to touch again. His fingers clenched around the pocket knife still in his hand, the jagged edge of the driftwood biting into his palm, grounding him just enough to keep from staggering. But inside he was unraveling. Was it you? The question wasn't just a request for an answer, it was a minefield. Every word rigged to detonate memories he'd spent years suppressing. His mind screamed to run, to turn on his heel and disappear into the Montana wilderness, back to the solitude of his cabin, where no one could ask questions that hurt this much. but his boots stayed rooted to the earth, as if the damp soil of Flathead Lake had claimed him, refusing to let go. The silence that followed the boy's question was suffocating, thicker than the autumn fog that hung over the lake at dawn. Daniel's throat burned, words he didn't have piling up like sand in his mouth. He felt the weight of every pair of eyes in that clearing, Hank's cautious concern, the other scout's awkward curiosity, and above all, the boy's unwavering stare. His heart slammed against his ribs, a war drum he couldn't silence. Guilt clawed at him first, a familiar beast, whispering that he'd failed someone somewhere, just like he'd failed so many on the battlefield. Then came the fear, raw, jagged, the kind that made his hands tremble as he wondered if he could even face whatever truth this kid was searching for. What if he was tied to this boy somehow? What if he wasn't, and he crushed the last flicker of hope in those young eyes? And underneath it all, a quiet, simmering anger, at himself, at the past, at the unfairness of a kid having to ask a stranger if he was the father who'd vanished from his life. Daniel forced his gaze away from the boy, staring at the lake's glassy surface as if it could swallow this moment whole. The Rockies loomed in the distance, their peaks sharp and unyielding, a reminder of how small he was against the vastness of his own pain. "Kid," he started, his voice rough as gravel, barely above a whisper. I'm not." He stopped, the words crumbling before they could form. How do you tell a child you're not the hero they're looking for when you're not even sure who you are anymore? He cleared his throat, trying again, but the boy's expression, part plea, part desperation, choked him silent. His mind flashed unbidden to Fallujah, to faces he couldn't save, to the letters he'd written to families back home, each one heavier than the last. Had he written to this boy's family? Had he known his father? The thought was a knife twisting deeper with every second he stood there, unable to answer. Hank stepped forward, breaking the silence like a man wading into a firefight unarmed. "Hey, buddy," he said to the boy, his tone gentle but firm, laying a hand on the kid's shoulder. "Let's give Sergeant Harper a minute, okay? Why don't you help with the fire pit over there?" The boy hesitated, his eyes still locked on Daniel, but he nodded slowly, letting Hank guide him away. The other scouts shuffled off too, sensing the unspoken weight of the moment, their earlier energy replaced by a subdued murmur. Hank turned back to Daniel, his broad face etched with concern. "You good, man?" I had no idea he'd ask something like that. Kid's name is Ethan, by the way. Lost his dad years ago, I think. His mom doesn't talk much about it. Daniel nodded curtly, though he was anything but good. "Yeah? Fine." The lie tasted bitter, but he didn't have the strength for anything else. He shoved the pocket knife into his jacket, his hands unsteady, and took a step back, needing distance, needing air. But there was no escaping the storm now. Ethan. The name lodged in his mind like shrapnel, sharp and unmovable. He didn't know this boy, didn't know his story, but the ache in his chest told him he couldn't just walk away. Not yet. Not when those eyes had looked at him like he might hold the key to a wound that had never healed. As the afternoon dragged on, Daniel went through the motions of his survival talk, his voice mechanical, his thoughts fragmented. He showed the scouts how to tie a proper knot, how to find north using the sun's position, but every word felt hollow. Ethan sat near the edge of the group, quieter than the others, his gaze flickering to Daniel every few minutes. Each glance was a silent plea, a question mark that hung in the air between them. Daniel avoided meeting his eyes, focusing instead on the pine needles underfoot, on the smoky scent of the campfire the boys had managed to start. But the tension coiled tighter with every second, a spring ready to snap. He knew he couldn't dodge this forever. The kid deserved something, an answer, a conversation, even if it tore Daniel apart to give it. After the lessons wrapped up, as the scouts dispersed to their tents for a break, Daniel found himself lingering by the lake's edge, the water lapping softly against the rocky shore. The sun was dipping lower now, casting long shadows across the clearing, the kind of golden light that made Montana feel like a painting, untouchable and serene. But there was no serenity in him. His mind churned with memories he'd tried to lock away, soldiers he'd served with, men whose names he carried like scars. Had one of them been Ethan's father? Had he failed someone close to this boy? The dog tags in his drawer back at the cabin flashed in his mind, a hidden relic of a past he couldn't face. He'd kept them not as a memento, but as a punishment, a reminder of everyone he couldn't bring back. Now they felt heavier than ever, as if they might hold a name he'd forgotten, a connection he'd buried. Footsteps crunched behind him, light and hesitant. Daniel's shoulders tensed, knowing who it was before he turned. Ethan stood a few feet away, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his scout jacket, his face pale under the smudge of dirt. The boy didn't say anything at first, just looked at the lake, mirroring Daniel's own avoidance. But the silence between them was louder than any words, thick with unspoken pain. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice small but steady. "I didn't mean to make you mad or nothing. I got a picture of my dad, but it's old. And Mom says I shouldn't keep asking people, but I saw your hat and I thought, maybe." Daniel's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking under the skin. He wanted to tell the kid to stop, to leave it alone, to let the past stay dead. But the raw hope in Ethan's voice was a tether, pulling him back from the edge of his own darkness. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "I'm not mad, kid. It's just complicated. War's complicated. I don't know your dad, but I've known a lot of soldiers. Too many." He paused, the weight of those losses pressing down, the faces flashing again, brothers in arms, lost to the desert. "What's his name? Your dad, I mean." Ethan's eyes brightened for a fleeting second, then dimmed with uncertainty. Thomas Reed. He was in the army like you. Mom says he was real brave. She's got a box of his stuff, but she cries when she looks at it, so I don't ask much." The name hit Daniel like a stray bullet, not a direct strike, but close enough to rattle him. Thomas Reed. It wasn't immediate, not a name he could place right away, but it tugged at something, a thread of memory buried under years of dust. His mind raced back to deployment, to the chaos of patrols, to the men he'd laughed with, fought with, lost. Had there been a Reed in his unit? He couldn't be sure, not yet, but the uncertainty was a new kind of torment. He rubbed a hand over the back of his neck, the familiar ache of guilt spreading through him. I don't know, Ethan. I'd have to think on it. There were a lot of names, a lot of good men." Ethan nodded, disappointment flickering across his face. But he didn't push. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph, creased at the edges from too much handling. He held it out to Daniel with trembling fingers. "This is him. If you remember anything, can you tell me? Even if it's bad. I just want to know what happened." Daniel hesitated, his hand hovering over the photo as if it might burn him. Taking it felt like a promise, a commitment he wasn't sure he could keep. But the look in Ethan's eyes, pleading, vulnerable, cracked something in him. A wall he'd built brick by brick since coming home. He took the photo, his fingers brushing against the boy's, and glanced at the image. A young man in uniform stared back at him, early 20s, with a crooked smile and eyes that held a spark of life Daniel hadn't seen in himself in years. The backdrop was desert, the kind of endless tan that haunted his dreams. He didn't recognize the face, not immediately, but the sight of that uniform, that sand, dragged him back to a place he'd fought to escape. His chest constricted, a phantom pain flaring where old wounds, physical and otherwise, still lingered. "I'll look into it," he said finally, his voice low, almost a growl. "Can't promise anything, but I'll try." The words felt inadequate, a bandage on a gaping wound, but they were all he had. Ethan nodded, a small grateful smile breaking through his uncertainty, and for a moment Daniel hated himself for giving the kid even that sliver of hope. What if he couldn't deliver? What if the truth was worse than the not knowing? Hank approached then, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel, a thermos of coffee in hand as a peace offering. "Thought you might need something warm," he said, handing it over with a knowing look. "Kid's been through a lot, you know. Mom's a single parent, works 2 jobs down in Polson. Ethan's got no uncles, no grandpas to lean on. Think he sees every man in a uniform as a chance to find what he's missing." Hank's tone was quiet, careful, but it carried a weight of its own, a subtle push for Daniel to step up, to be more than a shadow at the edge of this boy's life. Daniel took the thermos, the heat seeping through his calloused palms, but he didn't drink. He stared at the lake instead, the surface rippling now with a faint breeze reflecting the darkening sky. "Not sure I'm the guy to help with that," he muttered, the bitterness in his voice aimed more at himself than at Hank. "Got enough ghosts of my own without taking on someone else's." Hank didn't argue, just clapped him on the shoulder with a grip that was both reassuring and unyielding. Sometimes, helping someone else is the only way to quiet him. Just something to chew on. He walked off, leaving Daniel alone with the thermos, the photo still clutched in his other hand, and a storm of thoughts he couldn't outrun. That night, back in his cabin, Daniel couldn't sleep. The walls creaked with the wind, the kind of howl that echoed the loneliness of the Montana wilderness, and every sound was amplified by the silence within him. He sat at his small kitchen table, a single bulb overhead casting harsh shadows, the photo of Thomas Reed propped against an empty coffee mug. Beside it lay the dog tags he'd pulled from the drawer, their metal dull with age, each one a name, a story, a failure. He traced the embossed letters with a trembling finger, searching for Reed, searching for anything that might connect him to Ethan's father. The names blurred together, too many losses to count, and with each one the memories flooded back. Explosions, shouts, the weight of a dying man in his arms. His breath hitched, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the chill in the room. He hadn't looked at these tags in years, hadn't allowed himself to. Now they were a Pandora's box, and Ethan had unwittingly pried it open. He pushed the chair back, pacing to the window, staring out at the black expanse of the forest. The stars were out, brighter than ever, mocking him with their clarity. He thought of Ethan's face, the way hope and pain had warred in his expression. He thought of his own past, the men he'd promised to bring home, the promises he'd broken. And then, unbidden, a new memory surfaced, faint but persistent, a conversation in the barracks about a guy named Reed who'd just gotten word of a newborn son back in the States. Had that been Thomas? Had Daniel stood beside him joking about diaper duty, not knowing they'd never make it back to meet those kids? The fragment of recollection was torture, incomplete but damning, a hint of a truth he wasn't ready to face. The next morning, Daniel knew he couldn't sit on this any longer. The weight of Ethan's question, of that photo, was a grenade in his hands, pin pulled, waiting to blow. He drove into Polson, the familiar hum of his old truck a poor distraction from the turmoil inside. His destination wasn't the diner, not today. It was the local VFW Hall, a weathered building on the edge of town where veterans gathered to drink cheap beer and swap stories, some true, some not. If anyone might remember Thomas Reed, it'd be the old-timers there, men who'd seen more war than he had, who carried their own dog tags of memory. The hall smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, the walls lined with faded flags and black and white photos of soldiers long gone. Daniel felt out of place, as he always did in spaces like this, but he pushed through, asking quiet questions, showing the photo around. Most shook their heads, their eyes clouded with their own pasts, but one man, an older vet named Carl with a gray beard and a limp, paused, squinting at the image. "Reed, huh?" Carl's voice was rough, whiskey-soaked. "Think I remember a Tommy Reed, young guy, full of fire. Was with the 3rd Infantry, got hit bad in 03 or so 4, didn't make it back. Had a girl waiting on him, pregnant if I recall. Damn shame." Carl handed the photo back, his gaze distant. "You know his family?" Daniel's stomach dropped, the confirmation a punch he hadn't braced for. "Maybe," he rasped, barely getting the word out. Trying to figure that out. Carl nodded, no further questions, and Daniel left the hall with more weight on his shoulders than when he'd arrived. Thomas Reed was dead. Likely one of the names on a tag, one of the faces in his nightmares. And Ethan, God, Ethan, didn't know the full story. How do you tell a kid his father's a memory, a casualty of a war fought half a world away? How do you tell him you might have been there, might have failed to save him? Back at the cabin, Daniel sat with the photo again, the dog tag spread out like a battlefield before him. He found it then, the tag for Thomas Reed nestled among the others, a name he'd carried without realizing. The metal was cold against his skin, colder than the Montana night outside, and it burned with the weight of what it meant. He'd been in the same unit as Ethan's father. He'd likely been there the day Reed went down, though the memory was a blur of chaos and loss. Guilt surged, a tidal wave, drowning him in what-ifs. What if he'd been faster, stronger? What if he'd done more? And now, what did he owe this boy who'd stumbled into his life, asking questions he wasn't prepared to answer? The decision loomed, heavy as the Rockies themselves, unmovable and inevitable. He could walk away, return the photo to Ethan with a curt "I don't know him," and go back to his solitary existence, letting the boy's pain be someone else's problem. He could hide behind the walls he'd built, let the past stay buried. Or he could face it, face Ethan, face the truth, face the man he'd been and the man he'd failed to be. His hands shook as he held the dog tag, the sharp edges digging into his palm, drawing a thin line of blood. It was a symbol, that tiny drop of red, a reminder that some wounds never heal, not until you stop running from them. He made his choice in the quiet of that cabin, the wind howling outside like a chorus of ghosts. He'd go back to the scout camp tomorrow, find Ethan and tell him what he knew. Not all of it, not the gore, not the screams, but enough to give the kid a piece of his father to hold on to. He'd give him the dog tag, let him have that tangible memory, even if it came with pain. And maybe, just maybe, in doing so, Daniel could start to carry his own ghosts a little lighter. It wasn't redemption, not by a long shot, but it was a step, a march into a new kind of battle, one fought not with rifles, but with truth. As he folded the photo and tucked the tag into his pocket, Daniel felt the fracture in his dam widen, but for the first time in years he didn't try to patch it. Let it break, he thought, let it flood, because if he was going to drown, he'd do it on his terms, for a kid who deserved more than silence. And hey, if this story's hitting you hard, if it's cracking open something in your own chest, stick with us. Hit that subscribe button, join the journey, because we're not done yet. There's more to this fight, more to this pain, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The next morning broke with a sky so pale it looked like it had been drained of life, a fitting mirror to the weight pressing down on Daniel Harper's chest. He drove his old truck back to the scout camp near Flathead Lake, the engine's familiar rumble doing little to drown out the storm in his mind. The dog tag bearing Thomas Reed's name sat heavy in his jacket pocket, a tiny piece of metal that felt like it could crush him. His hands gripped the steering wheel too tight, knuckles white as if he could squeeze out the dread that had settled in his bones overnight. He hadn't slept, not really, just stared at the ceiling of his cabin, replaying every word he'd planned to say to Ethan, every jagged edge of memory that threatened to cut him open. What he was about to do wasn't just handing over a piece of the past. It was stepping into a firefight unarmed, unsure if he'd survive the blast. But he'd made his choice. He couldn't run from this boy's eyes, from the hope and hurt in them, not when he'd spent years running from his own. The camp came into view, a smattering of tents dotting the clearing, the air heavy with the scent of pine and lingering campfire smoke. The boys were already up, their voices carrying over the still morning, a mix of laughter and chatter that felt alien to Daniel, a reminder of a lightness he'd long forgotten. He parked on the gravel edge, cutting the engine, and sat there for a long moment, his breath fogging the windshield. The photo of Thomas Reed was tucked beside the dog tag, its creased edges a map of a child's longing. His stomach churned, a sick twist of guilt and fear, as he pictured Ethan's face when he'd hear the truth. Would it break him? Would it break Daniel to watch it happen? He forced himself out of the truck, boots crunching on the damp earth, each step heavier than the last. The cold bit at his face, but it was nothing compared to the ice in his veins. He scanned the group for Ethan, his heart pounding like a war drum, knowing there was no turning back now. Hank spotted him first, waving him over with a cautious nod, as if sensing the storm brewing beneath Daniel's stoic exterior. "Morning, Sergeant. Didn't expect you back so soon. Everything okay?" His voice was low, probing, a man who'd seen enough of life to know when someone was carrying a burden too heavy for words. Daniel nodded, the motion stiff, his jaw locked tight. "Need to talk to Ethan. Got something for him." Hank's brow furrowed, but he didn't press, just pointed toward the lake's edge, where a small figure sat alone, tossing pebbles into the water with a kind of absent intensity. Daniel's chest tightened further, a vice grip that threatened to crack ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to leave the dog tag on Hank's table with a note and disappear back to his cabin's solitude. But he'd made promises before, promises to men who never came home, and he'd be damned if he broke another, even if this one tore him apart. As he approached, Ethan didn't look up at first, his focus on the ripples spreading across the lake's surface, each pebble a quiet plea into the unknown. Daniel stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over the boy, and cleared his throat, the sound rough and foreign in the still air. "Hey, kid." Ethan turned then, his messy brown hair catching the weak morning light, his eyes widening with a flicker of hope that stabbed at Daniel like a bayonet. The boy scrambled to his feet, brushing dirt off his scout pants, his small frame vibrating with anticipation. Did you find out anything about my dad?" The question was a grenade, lobbed with innocent precision, and Daniel felt the explosion ripple through him, shredding the last of his defenses. He couldn't look away from those eyes, couldn't hide from the raw need in them. His hand went to his pocket, fingers brushing the dog tag, and for a moment he thought he might not be able to do this, might not be able to speak the truth that would change everything. The tension coiled tighter, a spring ready to snap, as the weight of every unspoken loss bore down on him. Fallujah, the desert sand, the names etched in his nightmares. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind howling behind him, and there was no safety net below. Daniel exhaled, a ragged breath that carried years of pain, and dropped to one knee, bringing himself level with Ethan. The ground was cold, seeping through his jeans, but he barely noticed. His voice, when it came, was low and unsteady, each word dragged out like it was made of lead. "Ethan." I looked into it, talked to some folks, dug through some old stuff of mine. "Your dad, Thomas Reed, he was a soldier, like you said. A good one. Brave. Just like your mum told you." He paused, his throat burning, watching the boy's face light up with a fragile hope that made this so much harder. "I found his name among some things I kept from back then. I was in the same unit, I think. I might have been there when it happened. He didn't make it back, kid. I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry." The words tasted like ash, bitter and final, and he saw the impact hit Ethan like a physical blow. The boy's lip trembled, his small hands balling into fists at his sides, but he didn't look away. Tears welled in those wide eyes, shimmering like the lake behind him, and Daniel felt his own vision blur, a sting he hadn't felt in years. He wanted to reach out, to pull the kid into a hug, to shield him from this hurt, but his arms stayed frozen, weighted by the guilt of a war he couldn't undo. Ethan's voice broke the silence, small and shattered. Did he say anything about me? Did he know I was born?" The question was a dagger, slicing through Daniel's chest, and he had to swallow hard to keep from breaking down right there. He didn't have the full memory, not the details, just fragments of a laughing voice in the barracks, a mention of a newborn son. But he nodded, because Ethan needed something to hold on to, even if it was a half-truth. "Yeah, kid." He knew. "Talked about you once, I think. Said he couldn't wait to meet you. He was proud, real proud." The lie, or maybe it wasn't a lie, maybe it was true, came easier than he expected, but it didn't lessen the ache. Ethan's tears spilled over then, silent tracks down his dirt-smudged cheeks, and he nodded, as if absorbing the weight of it, trying to carry a loss he'd always felt, but never understood until now. Daniel's own throat closed up, the sight of this boy's pain a mirror to every soldier he couldn't save, every family he'd failed. The tension was unbearable now, a pressure building behind his eyes, in his chest, threatening to split him wide open. He'd thought telling the truth would be the release, but it was just another wound, fresh and bleeding. Then Ethan did something Daniel hadn't expected. The boy stepped forward, closing the small distance between them, and wrapped his thin arms around Daniel's neck in a hug so tight it felt like a lifeline. The contact stunned him, a jolt through every nerve, and for a moment he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The warmth of the kid's small body, the quiet sobs muffled against his shoulder, cracked something deep inside him, a dam he'd built brick by brick since coming home. His arms moved then, almost on instinct, encircling Ethan, holding him as if he could absorb some of the hurt, as if he could shield him from a world that had already taken too much. "I'm sorry, kid," he whispered again, his voice breaking for the first time in years, raw and unguarded. "I wish I could have brought him back for you. Ethan didn't reply, just clung tighter. And in that moment, Daniel felt the weight of every ghost he carried shift, not disappear, but become something shared, something less suffocating. Tears he hadn't shed since the desert slipped free, hot against his cold skin, and he let them fall. Let himself feel the grief he'd buried under silence and solitude. It wasn't just for Thomas Reed, or for Ethan, but for himself, for the man he'd been, the man he'd lost, the man he might never find again. They stayed like that for a long minute, two broken souls by the lake, until Ethan pulled back, wiping his face with the sleeve of his scout jacket. His eyes were red, but there was something else there now, a quiet strength, a resolve Daniel recognized from the faces of soldiers facing impossible odds. "Zishi, for telling me," Ethan said, his voice shaky but firm, "and for remembering him." Daniel nodded, unable to speak, and reached into his pocket, pulling out the dog tag. The metal glinted in the weak light, a relic of a life cut short, and he held it out to the boy. "This was his. I've kept it all these years. Didn't even realize whose it was till now. You should have it. It's yours now." Ethan took it with trembling fingers, staring at the engraved name Thomas Reed, as if it were a treasure beyond measure. He clutched it to his chest, a silent promise to carry his father with him, and Daniel felt a piece of his own burden lift, a small but real release, though the ache remained. In the days that followed, Daniel wasn't the same man he'd been. The change wasn't loud or dramatic, no sudden transformation into someone whole, but it was there, in the quiet shifts, the subtle cracks, letting light into a life that had been shadowed for too long. He didn't return to the complete solitude of his cabin right away. Instead, he started showing up at the scout camp more often, not as a guest, but as a regular, helping Hank with the kids, teaching them knots and fire starting with a patience he didn't know he had. Ethan was always nearby, not clinging but present, a silent connection forged in shared loss. Daniel found himself watching the boy, noticing the way he'd smile sometimes, a small genuine thing while holding the dog tag under his shirt. It hurt to see, but it was a good hurt, the kind that reminded him why he'd fought in the first place, why he was still here when so many weren't. He made a sacrifice too, one that felt like cutting off a limb, but was necessary for whatever came next. Late one night, after the scouts had gone home for the week, Daniel returned to his cabin and pulled out the rest of the dog tags from the drawer. Each one a name, a story, a weight he'd carried alone for too long. He didn't throw them away. That would have been denying the men they represented. But he packed them into a small wooden box, the kind his grandpa had once used for fishing lures, and drove to the VFW Hall in Polson. There, with Carl and a few other vets watching in quiet understanding, he left the box on a shelf beside the faded flags, a shared memorial for men who'd understand better than anyone. It was a renunciation of the solitary guilt he'd clung to, a step toward letting others bear some of the load. Walking out of the hall, his pocket lighter without the constant jingle of metal, he felt exposed, vulnerable, but also freer, as if he'd laid down a rifle he'd carried for miles too long. It wasn't closure, not fully, but it was a start, a way to breathe without the constant crush of the past. There was one last gesture, one final piece to lay to rest. On a crisp Sunday morning, with the Montana sky finally showing a hint of blue, Daniel took Ethan and his mother, a quiet woman named Sarah with tired eyes and a cautious smile, to a small veterans' cemetery just outside Polson. Sarah had been hesitant when he'd called, her voice thick with years of guarded pain, but she'd agreed, sensing the weight of what he offered. At the cemetery, under a lone pine that stood sentinel over the rows of white markers, they found Thomas Reed's name etched in stone, a simple grave among many. Daniel stepped back as Ethan knelt, still clutching the dog tag, and placed a small hand-drawn picture beside the marker, a child's sketch of a soldier with a crooked smile, much like the one in the photo. Sarah's hand went to her mouth, stifling a sob, but her other hand reached for Ethan's shoulder, holding him close. Daniel watched from a distance, his own throat tight, feeling the ghosts of his past settle into something quieter. Not gone, but at rest for now. It was a moment of fragile beauty, a boy connecting with a father he'd never know, a mother finding a piece of peace, and a soldier finally honoring a promise he hadn't even known he'd made. Standing there, As the wind whispered through the pine needles, carrying the scent of earth and memory, Daniel felt the weight of time itself press against him. Time, that unrelenting march, doesn't heal all wounds, but it can teach you how to carry them. War takes, and it keeps taking, long after the guns fall silent. But in the spaces between the pain, there's room for something else: connection, remembrance, a chance to rebuild on broken ground. Healing isn't a destination. It's a slow, uneven road, paved with moments like this where loss and hope stand side by side, neither fully winning, but neither fully lost. And if this story has reached into your chest, pulled at something you didn't expect to feel, then let us know. Comment below with "I carry the weight too" if you felt the burden of loss, or if you found a way to share it. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they're not alone in their fight. And if you're walking this road with us, hit that subscribe button. There's more to uncover, more stories of breaking and mending, and we'd be honored to have you along for the journey.